Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Today is Thursday, March 14th, and we have a busy show ahead of us. We are going to start off by talking some NFL. We are going to start off with the Cowboys, who had a very slow start to free agency. They finally got on the board yesterday with their first signing, but it took place after 48 hours past the free agency period started. A lot of fans are up in arms about Jerry Jones's all-in comments and the way that they have not lived up to it just yet. So I'll be giving my thoughts on the offseason ahead for them. Then we are going to talk about the young quarterbacks in the NFL that have benefited from the first few days of free agency. It's important with both of these segments that we keep in mind there's still a lot of offseason ahead of us, but there are definitely some young QBs out here that have gained some big-time weapons that will help them going forward next season as they continue to develop. So we will be diving into all of that. In the second half of the show, we're going to talk some basketball, where we had a finals rematch last night between the Nuggets and the Heat and all the other NBA action that took place before finally wrapping up with some college basketball, as a few more teams have punched their tickets into March Madness. And yesterday was just a crazy set of games that we are definitely going to dive into. But before we get into the show, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe, wherever you may be keeping up with us, to stay up to date on all content that the GSMC Sports Network puts out. Also, for any of our live viewers, please feel free to use the comment section. I will address as many comments as I can, make this show as interactive as possible. And then finally, if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is gsmcpodcast.net. But getting into our first segment of the day, we are going to be talking about the Cowboys and the very interesting start or almost non-start that has taken place over the course of the past few days as free agency has opened up across the NFL. The Cowboys went the first 2 days without making any moves at all, other than they did re-sign a long snapper. But in terms of big impact moves, the Cowboys were going to be under a microscope, which they always are because they are the Dallas Cowboys. But owner Jerry Jones at the Senior Bowl said they are going to be all in, and everybody is very fixated on that specific term that Jerry Jones used. And now, as a result, anytime they don't do anything, it becomes that much bigger of a deal. So I do agree that, well, first we'll get into the one move they actually did make, which was signing linebacker Eric Kendricks to a one-year deal. This was very interesting because Kendricks was initially reported to be signing with the 49ers, but instead he reroutes and is on his way to Dallas. Kendricks is going to be entering his age 32 season in his 10th year in the NFL. He was once an All-Pro first-team selection with the Minnesota Vikings in 2019, and now he's actually reuniting with his former head coach, now defensive coordinator of the Cowboys, Mike Zimmer, who they just brought in. So Kendricks is a nice player and at a position of need for the Cowboys, where their linebacking group has really been riddled with injuries and as a result has been underperforming. I think this was their biggest need, and they go get a veteran who has been doing this for a long time. He has 8 straight seasons with over 100 total tackles, which should help out the Cowboys. But despite that, it has been an underwhelming start to free agency for Cowboys fans, where they saw many of their starters from last year leave. Tyler Biadasz, their center, Tony Pollard, Dorrance Armstrong, and Stephon Gilmore are all on their way out and going to new teams. It is also still up in the air, but staple of their offensive line, Tyron Smith, is not expected to be back as of now. At least that could change, but we are seeing a lot of departures for the Cowboys. And again, after saying that the team was going to be all in, a lot of people were really fixated on what the Cowboys were going to do this offseason. And we're only a few days into this, so does this mean that they're going to be a dumpster fire next year? Definitely not. But this is a disappointing, I think, beginning to free agency. Now, I want to make it clear that two things. A, it is still very young in the offseason. I don't think that it would have really been possible. I just don't believe it's possible to win a Super Bowl in March as it is. So I wouldn't say this is a full-time panic mode for Cowboys fans. So I'll start by saying that. I also do feel like the way that if you are going to attack free agency aggressively, that can tend to overpaying at times. And the Cowboys, who are in a bit of a financial situation both currently and having 3 cornerstone players being eligible for contract extensions in CeeDee Lamb, Dak Prescott, and Micah Parsons, there's a lot that goes into this, and they can't really afford to go out there overspending. That being said, doing nothing is pretty surprising here, especially I thought in the running back market where we saw all of these different guys moving around teams, and some more than others getting pretty solid deals, but also not overly expensive. I specifically look at the likes of a Derrick Henry, who is getting $8 million per year annually from the Baltimore Ravens. Why the Cowboys couldn't go out and make a move similar to that, I really don't have an answer for you. As it currently stands, JioSaavn is their running back 1, and I just don't think that that is a recipe for success. Now, there are still other guys out there on the market, but all of the top-end talent in a very well-rounded running back class this free agency has already been snatched up, and the Cowboys are sitting here with very little to show. I also thought, not that they necessarily had to make the move, but when you talk about being all in and you look at what the Giants gave up for defensive end Brian Burns, I see no reason why the Cowboys couldn't have gone out and addressed that position as well. And they're losing Dorrance Armstrong, who granted was more of a rotational defensive piece for them, but still a player at the position as well. And the Giants just gave up a 2nd and a 5th round pick. Obviously, it came with a big extension after that as well. And they are going to still have to pay Micah Parsons that big money. But I'm just thinking out loud here. If you're going to be all in for this season, Jerry Jones, when he made this comment, he specifically referenced the Rams Super Bowl team from a couple years ago, where they went out and they made these big time moves, and they really put all their eggs in the basket for that 2021 season. And it ultimately panned out in a championship for them. 2022 was a down year, but with a well-run organization, you can help build yourself back up, and we saw the Rams trend upwards, make the playoffs last season, and they were a very solid team under good coaching, and they had good players. And the Cowboys, I just see no reason why, again, if you're talking all in, you go get an edge rusher like Brian Burns. That is probably a top 10 edge rusher in the league, and that's all you had to pay him. Now, again, probably somewhat came into a situation where Burns, I mean, he didn't have to sign off on the trade. He could have been upset maybe if he was traded without promise of a long-term deal. But again, just thinking out loud here, I don't want to bury the Cowboys for this move specifically, but again, it's very strange how slow this has all developed for the Cowboys, which begs to ask the question, where do they go from here? And like I mentioned, the priority for them is definitely to extend their key players. It's going to be interesting to see how they sort of balance which players will be the priority for them. As of now, it seems like CeeDee Lamb is the number one on the to-do list to get him under contract long term. He's entering the final year of his rookie deal. He put together the best receiver season we've seen from a Dallas Cowboy since prime Dez Bryant. He was the first receiver to be all-pro first team since Dez's season in 2014. And Micah Parsons, who is another one of these big-time players for them, he still has 2 years left on his rookie deal. He outwardly said to the media that he is willing to wait for them to pay Lamb before he gets his contract of his own, knowing the timeline of the situation and understanding sort of how things need to play out here in order to retain this nucleus. It's also interesting when you talk about Dak Prescott, who has come with all types of different takes in terms of how good is he, how much is he worth. Now, he is entering the final year of his contract. He signed an extension in a few years ago, and now it is coming up to an end here. They have not had any negotiations up to this point between Prescott and the Dallas Cowboys. NFL Network's Jane Slater reported that it shouldn't be too much of a cause for concern, that she expects this to take place more so along the lines of August. It also becomes a little bit more interesting now that there's this story that's coming out about the sexual assault allegations against the quarterback. Now, he's being investigated by the police. He is also filing a lawsuit against the woman that accused him for extortion. So all of this is alleged at the moment. There's a lot to unpack, and that starts with the police doing their duties to sort of resolve all of this. But this just came out a couple days ago. We are still very scarce for details on this. But if you take this out of consideration, which it is a big deal, but again, a lot of unknowns in this scenario. If you're talking about Dak Prescott, the player on the field, I do personally think that they should look to extend him. And I know that the idea of wrapping up $50 million plus in a quarterback that isn't top 3 is a tough pill to swallow. But I think when you look at the Cowboys here, it's either that or you sort of have to blow up the whole operation, because Dak Prescott, I know that he's not many people's favorite quarterbacks out there, but he was a very good quarterback this past year, and he was second in MVP voting. He was the runner-up, so he was all-pro second team as well. He led the league in touchdowns. This was the best season of his career, and I think that that is sort of more so who he is. I know the playoff success is still a little bit up in the air, but when you take into consideration that Kirk Cousins just got $45 million, I view Dak and Kirk to be very similar in terms of where they rank among the NFL quarterbacks. And I feel like once Dak Prescott is gone, you have a very similar situation to the Vikings. Now, the Cowboys are closer to contention to at least some degree than the Vikings were last year. So now the Vikings, they have a lot of work to do anyways as it is with their talent on the roster as a whole. Now they're settling for Sam Darnold on a 1-year contract. Unless you think that Trey Lance can come in and somehow turn himself into a franchise quarterback, the Cowboys don't have a backup plan, and I don't think that the infrastructure with the Cowboys is strong enough to just let a very good quarterback walk in free agency. I look a lot because another quarterback that's coming up on the final year of their contract is Tua Tagovailoa for the Miami Dolphins. They're very similar in some sense, in terms of public perception of them, is not extremely high. They are flawed quarterbacks. I think that Dak is better, but neither of them have really proven to be anything in the postseason either. I just feel like when you look at the structure of both of these organizations, I feel like the Miami Dolphins have done a very good job to build up the personnel on that offense to make it a very quarterback-friendly system. Now, of course, Mike McDaniel coming out of the Shanahan-McVay coaching tree, we've seen these offenses be able to be sustained with maybe not star power at the quarterback position alone. Not going to get into the debate of how good Brock Purdy is, but he was very easily, as a 7th-round rookie, able to slide into the position, and they've gone to back-to-back NFC championships and almost won a Super Bowl. I think the Dolphins are structured a little bit in a similar way, where you have a couple elite weapons on the outside in Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. You have a solid offensive line. The pre-snap motions and some of the run scheme, when you look at the misdirections and different looks that they throw at you, I think it's one of the most nuanced run games in the NFL. That's not the luxury that the Dallas Cowboys have, where Mike McCarthy, a little bit of the older guard, he still has some questions surrounding himself. And while CeeDee Lamb is obviously elite, I don't view the rest of the offense to be in that same light. And for them going forward here with Dak as their guy, they could also look to restructure a deal that opens up more cap space for them in this coming season. We see this happen all the time. We saw the way that it worked out for Kirk Cousins in Atlanta this past year. Patrick Mahomes regularly goes back to that massive deal that he signed with Kansas City, and just deferring the guaranteed money and all those different things that helps reduce the salary cap hit. Ultimately, we're still a few months away from that, so it's not something we need to dive into really any much longer when we're talking specifically about Dak Prescott, but it is an interesting thing to consider here as the Cowboys move forward. And in terms of currently what the Cowboys can do and what they will do, the Jones all-in quote, when he first mentioned it, when he first mentioned the Rams, I sort of thought it sounded like he was going to be leaning towards moving off of some draft capital to go out and get a disgruntled star maybe around the league. And there are some options that could be available. Stephon Diggs has been talked about for months now. Devontae Adams as well. If you're looking at the running back position, Alvin Kamara could be somebody that becomes available as well. I can't imagine that A, the Vikings would make this move, or B, the Cowboys have the money to make it work. But imagine they get Justin Jefferson for this upcoming season. I think that is what I consider to be all in. Again, depends on how literal you want to take that quote in itself, but I would like to see the Cowboys make some sort of moves here. It's going to be interesting how they weigh using their draft picks to fill in some of the holes versus going out and potentially trying to move on from those to get a star. Currently, they can maybe trade future draft capital and try and balance both of those. But again, a lot is still up in the air here for the Cowboys. I do really want to see them get some help additionally on the back end of their secondary. I feel like safety is a position of weakness for them. A random name I just wanted to throw out there is Cooper DeJean out of Iowa. I think he could be a nice fit for the Cowboys, could be somewhere around that draft range as well. He has some positional flexibility. He played a lot of cornerback in college, but a lot of scouts also project him to be more of a safety when he reaches the NFL. So just a name out there. I also feel like they could look to address the offensive line in this draft as well. So those are the two positions, because I do think that despite how terrible their playoff performance was against the Packers, it was an extremely uncharacteristic defensive game if you look at how the defense operated on the season as a whole, and everything fell apart for them there. Now they're losing some players, so they have to sort of fill in those gaps, but I don't think that they are extremely far away from being in contention, especially when you look at that NFC that I don't think has the juggernaut of the Chiefs that teams have to get through in order to make the Super Bowl. But that is all we have time for on this subject today. Trust me, it's the Cowboys. If you want more talk, I'm sure it will be coming. Hopefully not too much, but we will keep you updated on all things in regards to that as the offseason continues. For now, we are going to be taking our first break of the show, and when we come back on the other side, I want to dive into some of the young quarterbacks that have benefited the most from the first few days of free agency. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about the Dallas Cowboys and their slow start to the offseason in the first segment. Now we are going to be moving on to our next, which is talking about some of the young quarterbacks in the NFL and talk about who has benefited most from the first few days of free agency. We still, of course, have the draft coming up, so there are chances for some of these teams to add additionally, but I did think that a few teams specifically did a solid job in these first couple days to try and help surround their potential franchise guys with some additional talent. The first of which, the biggest winner, I believe, out of the young quarterbacks is Will Levis of the Tennessee Titans. They just gained the most from all positions. Yesterday, the news breaks that they signed Calvin Ridley to a massive 4-year deal worth $92 million. Ridley was the top wide receiver on the market this offseason, especially when you consider some of the free agency tags that were applied to Michael Pittman and T. Higgins. So Ridley was really the main target for a lot of these teams that were looking to add strength in the receiver room. And the Titans came at a little bit of a surprise. It had just been reported the day before that the Patriots and Jaguars were the finalists to get Ridley, but the Titans swoop in here and give the big offer. Now, there was a little bit of a connection if you look at how this possibly could have played out, where the Titans' new offensive coordinator, Nick Foles, he was the passing game coordinator with the Jaguars last season where Ridley was. So it seems like the two of them may have had a connection, that Foles seems to think that there's something he can really tap into here with Ridley. It seems like whatever connection they had ended up helping to get this deal done. Now, Ridley had a nice season in 2023. He had over 1,000 yards. He had 8 touchdowns, he was a bit inconsistent on a game-to-game basis. He had more games with 40 or less yards than he did with 100 yards. 9 games with 40 or less, just 4 with over 100. Now, 100 is definitely a big ask, especially for a player who was playing in a little bit of an inconsistent offense as it was anyways, especially once Trevor Lawrence went down with injury. But even before then, for whatever reason, the offense just was not able to function at the level that at least myself and I feel like other people expected them to coming into last season. But this is a nice addition for the Titans. They have a true number 1 wide receiver, which they have been missing ever since they traded A.J. Brown a couple off seasons ago. The receiving core as a whole should be pretty solid for next year in terms of the talent that's playing on the perimeter for Will Levis. I mean, it would be an incredible receiver room if this was 2020, having Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins, but even still, should be a pretty solid group this upcoming year. It seemed like when Levis took over, DeAndre Hopkins was able to be more unlocked, of course, with that explosive first game, but now they can continue to build on that into next season. They do still have Treylon Burks as well, who is yet to make a real impact since being a first-round pick in 2022. The Titans were hoping that he could be the replacement for A.J. Brown. That has not taken place yet. He's been dealing with some injuries and just has not really made his mark yet on the NFL. But it does feel like there is still some level of talent that has just been untapped up to this point. They also yesterday re-signed their receiver Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, where he's nothing all too spectacular. He was an undrafted rookie when they brought him in, and he's been very solid for them the past couple years, but is just a good depth option for them, I believe, especially when you have, DeAndre Hopkins, who is older. You have Burks, who has injury concerns and hasn't really fully established himself yet either. And their tight end as well, it's Okonkwo. I don't know how to pronounce his first name still. Chigoziem, I think it is. But a solid tight end option as well. Now, they also added a new center in free agency in Lloyd Cushenberry. He was with the Broncos last year. So they pay him some big money, bring him in to lead the offensive line, and they additionally add Tony Pollard, who I think we can all agree is a downgrade from Derrick Henry in terms of being a pure running back. But I am also intrigued in his ability to be an option out of the backfield for Will Levis. Now, I know that the efficiency last year was not good at all, but he still is able to be at least a factor in the receiving game. He topples over Derrick Henry in terms of targets and receptions over the course of the past few seasons, for whatever that means. I just think it could be an interesting addition there. And this is all for Levis, who there's still a lot of unproven with him. He was a second-round pick, 33rd overall in last season's draft. He is interesting where he had some first-round buzz going into the draft. A lot of people really dinged him for his senior season at Kentucky, where it was pretty underwhelming. He took a step back in terms of statistics and team success, but he is a mobile player, and he was dealing with some injuries, and he was on a Kentucky team his senior year that really wasn't all too talented. So I think it's more so when you look at Levis about what the highs potentially could be, and he showed some of those highs and flashes when he started taking over in Week 8 for the Titans, where in his first game as a starter, he threw for 4 touchdowns. And again, like I mentioned, that's really when it seemed like DeAndre Hopkins was becoming unlocked, and Levis's season wasn't all pretty. There were some tough ones in there for him, but the flashes were there. He had a great comeback against the Dolphins in week 14. The primetime game he played against the Steelers ended in a game-sealing interception for him, but led a pretty solid drive where he almost put the Titans in position to win in his second start in primetime against one of the best defenses in the league last season in the Steelers. So ultimately, I think that there is talent there. Now, injuries derailed the latter part of his season. Again, a little bit of a recurring theme maybe from college as well. But ultimately, I think he has an improved offense around him, and we can learn more about whether or not he will be a franchise quarterback. Additionally, I think that another young guy from last year's draft, Bryce Young, does actually benefit from the moves the Panthers have made up to this point, where they went out and paid a couple of offensive linemen to try and help keep Young actually on his feet this year. They signed Robert Hunt from the Dolphins and Damian Lewis from the Seahawks to some lucrative multi-year deals. Both of these players' guards can be seen as a little bit of an overpay, but also at the same time, this is the state of the Panthers. They need to overspend a little bit to actually get themselves up off the ground as this rebuild sort of begins. I know that last year was a little bit of the start of the rebuild, but not even having your own pick in the first round hurts that for sure. But both Lewis and Hunt heading into their fifth seasons, coming off of their rookie deals. The Panthers are hoping that these can be key guys for them as they continue this rebuild. But Bryce was the second most sacked quarterback in the league last year, sacked 62 times, just behind Sam Howell for number one. Addressing the offensive line was an absolute need for the Panthers this offseason, and ideally you would want them to address the offensive tackle position maybe a little bit more, but you'll take what you can get for the Panthers, where I think a lot of the tackle options weren't necessarily the best this offseason, and there's a lot of age with them, a lot of injury concern, and ultimately, not that their guards that they brought in were elite players, but you also just hope that it is a step in the right direction for them. They are also hoping for Ika Mekwonu, their 6th overall pick in 2022. They're hoping that he can really emerge as a franchise building block, as a blindside tackle. He's been pretty average through the course of the first couple seasons. He was the first offensive lineman taken in his draft. They're hoping that he can develop a little bit more. Still plenty of time on his rookie deal to see if that is the case, but that would do wonders for Bryce Young if the blind side was able to be locked up. They also went out and they traded for wide receiver Deontay Johnson. This took place just yesterday, where the Panthers trade with the Steelers for Johnson. They move the 178th pick in the upcoming draft and cornerback Dante Jackson for Deontay Johnson and the 240th. So it's player for player and swapping picks. I think this was good value for both teams, where Deontay Johnson is going to be the best receiver on the team next season unless they work something else out during the course of this offseason. He's a fine player. I know that the past couple seasons have been disappointing. He was a Pro Bowler in 2021 and just hasn't given the same level of production since then. But I also amount at least some of that to the situation in Pittsburgh, where the offense was really struggling, really stagnant, and they just couldn't really get themselves together all too much. Now he gets a new start in Carolina, where, to be fair, still a lot of unknowns in Carolina as well, but at least Bryce Young, from his perspective, he has a guy. It was actually interesting. Deontay Johnson could have been a Kansas City Chief if the Panthers didn't come in and make this move. They were in talks with Pittsburgh about potentially making a move. So the Panthers actually steal him from the Chiefs. So if you are a Chiefs hater, you can call it that, maybe thank the Panthers for this one. If you think that Deontay Johnson can be an effective player, which I do. So the Panthers have a long ways away before being a contender, but this season is all about just making sure that Bryce Young is in position to succeed. Of course, everything they gave up around the draft last season to trade up and draft him number 1. They have a lot banking on this player, and their top priority is making sure that he can succeed. You move off of a talented cornerback in Jackson. I think that's a good addition for the Steelers in this one to also get an improved draft pick as well with that. But ultimately, when you look at the Panthers situation here, it's really unfortunate that they don't have their own first round pick, because if they did, they would be in prime position to take on further draft picks, probably add a top tier weapon from this class. But the strength of the receiver class does extend to the second round, so there's still a good chance that the Panthers could find their way into getting a receiver. Then they have the number 33 pick and the number 39 pick that they got from the Giants. Final young quarterback that I think won was CJ Stroud. They upgraded in the run game with Joe Mixon. This was a trade that took place. The Bengals were planning on releasing him. They end up moving a 7th round pick to get him, which is nice because the Texans were at the bottom of the league in most rushing statistics last season. 23rd in total rush yards, 28th in yards per attempt, 23rd in rushing touchdowns. Devin Singletary was better in the second half of the season, but Joe Mixon is definitely an upgrade for them. They bring back Dalton Schultz at the tight end position, who is a nice player for them, was a pretty big red zone threat. I know it was only 5 touchdowns, but still just made things a lot easier for them. It's going to get Tank Dell ideally back from injury as well. I also really like the moves that they made on defense to sort of solidify that group, which could do a couple things. One, if you're looking at them as a true contender, some of the defensive lapses late in the game that forced CJ Stroud to bring on the heroics was an encouraging sign for him personally. But again, if you want to be taken as a more serious team, defense needs to lock up a little bit more in these late game stretches. They bring in Danielle Hunter, Azeez Al-Shaair, and Danico Autry. If you are a Jeff Okudah believer, he was also brought in as well, for whatever that means. But I liked the Texans offseason as well. I do have a couple names here. We don't really have time for it to fully dive in, but in case we had extra time, I did write down a couple quarterbacks that were not helped out, and that is Kenny Pickett and Justin Fields. Kenny Pickett, with Russell Wilson coming into the room, he's going to be breathing right down his neck, looking for that starting opportunity, and that is very possible that takes place. We'll have to monitor that quarterback battle. And Justin Fields, who currently is stuck in Chicago with not much of a market for him elsewhere, going to be continuing to see how this all plays out as well. But that is all we have time for on this subject. We're going to be taking our second break, and when we come back, we will get into some NBA talk from last night's action. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We just finished up talking some NFL for the day. Now we are going to be switching gears to basketball, starting with the NBA here, where we had a lot of action from last night, headlined by the second iteration of the finals rematch from June, where the Denver Nuggets played the Miami Heat. The Nuggets end up winning this game 100-88, and while the final score was a 12-point margin of victory for the Nuggets, I will say I actually thought that the Heat were more impressive in this game than they were in the previous. The Nuggets and the Heat just played a few weeks ago, and in that one, the Nuggets really dominated for the majority of the game before the Heat were able to bring it back within the striking distance, you can call it. They played at the end of February and ended up losing by 6 in that one. But I thought that for 80% of the game, probably more, I thought that the Nuggets just looked like they were on a different level than the Heat. And last night, again, I know that the score difference was actually larger in this one, but I was a lot more impressed by the Heat in this game, specifically because they made Nikola Jokic look as human as he has looked in years, really, where he was held to just 12 points, and that was in large part due to, yes, they sent some double teams at him, but I thought that Bam Adebayo was incredibly effective as a defender in this one, just taking on that matchup in the post and really winning a lot of these looks. And ultimately, you know, the Jokic hadn't scored. Jokic had scored under 15 points. I believe this was his 4th time all season. So a very nice performance from Bam on the defensive end, and from the Heat in general, only allowing 100 points, but offense continues to be inconsistent with them, which is the issue. If you want to spin it, that means that the offense should be coming. They were without Tyler Hero in this game, who also missed the previous game to the Nuggets. So we still haven't really seen how he fits into this puzzle with Miami versus Denver. And Denver has ultimately dominated the series between the two of these, dating back to the finals last year. But they were able to compete. They were able to stick in this game, and it got into a clutch situation. Of course, under 5 minutes left in the game, 5 points or less of a differential. And ultimately, it wasn't Jokic, it wasn't Murray, it wasn't Michael Porter Jr., but it was Reggie Jackson who started knocking down some tough shots for the Nuggets and scored 7 straight for them, which put the Nuggets up 10. Ultimately, again, the Heat didn't have the legs under them offensively to come back after that. But ultimately, I feel like I'm being a little more optimistic about the Heat than I would have expected myself to. The Heat are now on a 4-game losing streak, which is a little bit concerning. But ultimately, they're in that play-in threshold with the Pacers, the Bulls, and the Hawks. They're the best team out of that group, and I would be shocked if they didn't make the playoffs. I expect them to, and whoever, hopefully not the Celtics as a biased fan here, but whoever gets matched up against them in the first round is going to have a tough out without a doubt. On one positive here for the Heat, before looking more so at the Nuggets side of this game, is Terry Rozier has started to put his efficiency together. It's been a very rough start for him in Miami, but we're seeing more and more of these good performances. Specifically, I really like the way that he and Bam Adebayo have been able to work a 2-man game with the pick and roll. I feel like he just adds a different element of offense from a ball handler position that the rest of the team doesn't really have. I just think he's slightly more dynamic as a scorer. I do think that there's upside with him from the playmaking side of this as well. So that is another thing you can sort of take out of this as a positive if you are a Heat fan looking at last night's results. But I thought what was very interesting now is the fact that in both of these matchups between the Nuggets and the Heat this season, it's been Michael Porter Jr. that has been the leading scorer for them. If you remember, at the end of February, he scored 30 points through the first 3 quarters. The Nuggets offense got a little stagnant at the end as the Heat started to take control. Ultimately, he finished with 30 in that one, but I did think that was a positive as well. The Nuggets still, when you look at their overall turnover numbers, it's not incredibly alarming, but it does just feel, it doesn't look the same, I feel like, that it has in the past in terms of they just have some of these weird miscommunication turnovers that's very uncharacteristic for this team. Now, am I panicking? No, I still think that they are the best team in the NBA and they should be favorites to repeat as champions, but it just hasn't really quite been the same level of how smooth their offense looks. Now, this was a subpar Jokic game, but like also a subpar Jokic game is an above average game for the majority of the NBA. He was 12 points, 14 rebounds, 6 assists, and was still 5 of 8 from the field. So it's not like he was really struggling. He just wasn't getting the looks that he was typically hoping for. And we know how Jokic plays. He always prefers to pass off to his teammates, but it was a very sluggish game. Last thing I'll say, again, definitely not an overreaction, but we've seen in a couple of these big games, the Nuggets are able to win, but their offense hasn't really showed up. The same was against their matchup against the Celtics a couple weeks ago. It was last week, Thursday possibly, but it is interesting to me the way that that their offense hasn't really come to play in that big time way against some of these key matchups. Now, the Nuggets are very average as a 3-point shooting team. They're currently 14th in the league. So, again, I wouldn't say that it's anything to overreact about, but it is a little bit of an interesting subplot that I'm looking at in terms of their offense going forward. The other big game from last night, big performance specifically, was DeMar DeRozan in the Bulls matchup against the Indiana Pacers. This was going on at a similar time, so the majority of my attention was fixated on the finals rematch between the Heat and the Nuggets. But as that game was wrapping up, started catching wind to just how good DeMar was in this matchup, and he took it to another level down the stretch of this game, where DeMar is somebody that, I mean, at this point, I know we're still 20 or so games away from the end of the season. He is absolutely making his argument for Clutch Player of the Year. If you have any interest in that award, he was absolutely phenomenal down the stretch of this game, where he was doing everything for them, including they were down by 3 points with 5 seconds left. He gets intentionally fouled, goes to the free throw line, makes the first free throw, does a very interesting strategy. I feel like you see a lot of people when they try and intentionally miss free throws, they just sort of whip it off of the rim. He put a bunch of arc on it. I'm pretty sure that this was an intentional miss, so I'm not trying to give him too much credit if he doesn't deserve it, but it looked like he purposefully put on extra arc so it bounced straight up when it came down, and one of the Pacers players slapped it out of bounds to make sure that the Bulls didn't get another chance at this. Bulls have no timeouts. It's just DeMar DeRozan in the short corner on the baseline, catches, fades, shoots, makes it, and sends it to overtime. And then once they got into overtime as well, he is taking over for them. He knocks down a three. He's hitting an and one runner. getting himself up over 40 points. And then from there too, even when he was off ball, just the know-how with him, he is such a veteran, and this is why I wouldn't call it a shame necessarily, because again, I feel like at times I've almost been a little bit frustrated where I've wanted to see more of the Bulls offense down the stretch other than just DeRozan going to work, but he was able to conduct the offense down the stretch in a really impressive way, where at one point the Bulls are coming up the court. Ayo Dosunmu has the ball up top, and you can see the way that they set up the play. DeRozan has Pascal Siakam on him. Siakam is denying him. He stands at the around half court on the opposite end, and he's specifically pointing to Dosunmu saying, "This is you." Vucevic brings Miles Turner out to the corner with him. He has to respect that. Vucevic had a actually, he didn't have that good of a game, realistically, but he is a threat from three. And again, this was DeRozan being a coach on the court, setting Dosunmu up. He drives past Halliburton, gets the layup, and then the next possession, it was DeRozan being doubled up top. He makes the pass to Caruso in the paint around the free throw line, who makes the next relay pass down low to Torrey Craig, gets the layup, and the Bulls pull away from there. But this was an incredible game for DeMar. 46 points, 9 rebounds on 15-24 shooting splits. I thought this was one of the best games I've maybe ever seen from DeMar DeRozan. And again, you can just see the maturity with him, the basketball understanding, and it shouldn't be surprising necessarily for DeRozan, who at this point has been in the league for over a decade, came in the 2009 draft. So this shouldn't be new news, but I do think that DeRozan just does continue to impress me on occasion, and I wanted to give him his flowers for that. Last couple things I will point to with the NBA last night. The Detroit Pistons, who I have sort of been on this hill where I do not think that they're as bad as their record shows, and they've been playing a lot better since the All-Star break. They win back-to-back games. Now, before I get ahead of myself, I will note that it's against the Hornets and the Raptors, so I'm not trying to make things out to be bigger than they should, but Jalen Duren is somebody that I think does not really get the attention that he should for somebody that can be one of the potential best bigs in the NBA. I see no reason why he can't be to the similar skill level of Bam Adebayo. I feel like they have some similar characteristics, especially when you look at a young Bam. And last night, Duren with a 20-20 game, it was 24 points, 23 rebounds, and 5 assists. I just feel like we're seeing him create with the ball more himself. He's been a dominant rebounder since he started getting minutes his rookie year, and I think that the Pistons are actually building something here. I know that the record is 12-53 now, so I can't give them all too much props, but they have the 3 players at each position in Jaden Ivey, Cade Cunningham, and Jalen Duren. The move that they made to trade for Simone Fontecchio during the trade deadline, that is, sort of went under the radar, because Fontecchio sort of came out of, at least in my eyes, sort of came out of nowhere this year. A European player that came in, was a 27-year-old rookie last season, and was playing for a Utah team this year that does not get a lot of national attention, but he's been very solid for the Pistons since coming over, averaging 15 points across 14 games, shooting 48-42 shooting splits. I just wanted to give the Pistons some love here briefly, because nobody else is talking about them for good reason, because of the season that they're having. But I just want Pistons fans to know that I do believe in the process that's going on there. But other than that I guess briefly I will talk about as well the Lakers losing to the Sacramento Kings. Domantas Sabonis now being 20-0 against Anthony Davis. He put up another terrific performance and really was going right at AD is not scared of that matchup at all, which is a good sign for him. 17 points, 19 rebounds, 10 assists on 6 of 10 from the field. Again, he was going at Anthony Davis. He was not scaring away, and AD wasn't scared either. He just wasn't as effective. He was 7 of 18 from the field, not bad, but also when you're talking about Sabonis, the defense can be very lackluster at times, and the way that he is able to, and it's by committee to some degree, the way that he is able to handle that matchup is really, really inspiring if you are a believer in the Kings and in Domantas Sabonis. But also, when you want to look at this game for the Lakers and the Kings, it was close through the first half. The third quarter absolutely killed the Thunder's hopes of the Lakers' chance of winning this one, where they turned the ball over 6 times. The offense was just falling apart. They scored just 17 points. And the way that the Kings were scoring and shooting the entire night, it was just putting themselves in a hole that was insurmountable. They tried to make a couple runs in the fourth quarter to make it close, but every time they did, it was Harrison Barnes knocking down a big three. De'Aaron Fox ultimately had the dagger in the corner, but the Kings shot 19 of 41 from 3. And again, the Lakers offense sort of got themselves together as well, but that defense is the issue. And granted, this was, give the Kings credit, it was great shot making. It wasn't just defensive lapses, but I just don't know if you necessarily trust the Lakers either to come up with the defensive stops in big moments. But that is all we have on the NBA games from last night. We're going to be taking our final break. And when we come back, we are going to dive into a crazy night of college basketball that took place last night. So stick with us, and we will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We are headed into our final segment of the day. We are going to be talking some college basketball. Just a reminder here that for our viewers to use the chat, make this show as interactive as possible. But talking college basketball from last night, we had a whirlwind of different games, where we will start off by talking about the few teams that punched their ticket to the dance with some conference titles, starting with McNeese beating Nichols to win the Southland Conference Tournament Final. This is a really big win for McNeese, who, if you haven't heard of them from this year, they have been on a terrific tear this year, winning 30 games this season. They could have possibly been an at-large bid if they didn't win the conference tournament, but they would have been right on that bubble, and I think that despite the 30 wins, it could have been really tough for them to make it into the tournament. Instead, they do. They finish off their season well, and they're going to be a very interesting team here when the brackets are released. This is their first tournament appearance since 2002, and they could definitely be seen as a popular Cinderella team. I think they are going to. They'll probably be in that 12-13 seed range, And we all know the nation's love for a good 12 seed as a Cinderella run. I think that McNeese could potentially be that Cinderella team. Other teams that made their way into the tournament with wins yesterday is Colgate. They rode a hot first half against Lehigh to handedly beat them and win the Patriot League. This is the fourth time they have reached the fourth straight season they have reached the tournament. They were a popular upset team last year. They did not do so and have really flown more under the radar this season, which I think potentially makes them even scarier as a first round upset. So another team to look out for. And then you had Montana State beating Montana in the Big Sky Championship, where this was a little bit of a disappointing season for the Bobcats. This is their third straight Big Sky Championship, so they've been here before, but they were just 500 on the season as a whole. Ultimately, though, they win their tournament, they win their conference tournament, and they will be in the big dance. We also had a set of wild games from the major conferences as well. We had Clemson suffering a blowout loss that could really put their at-large bid in jeopardy. They lost 76-55 against Boston College. The Eagles now have a couple of dominant wins to try and put together a Cinderella run for themselves. But for Clemson here, they lose their last two games of the season to BC now, and they also lost to Wake Forest in the last game of the regular season, and they do so against BC in ugly fashion. The ACC has not seemed to get a lot of love from the national media and the selection committee this season. We know that Duke and UNC are locks, but outside of that, there is a lot up in the air. There is Clemson, Wake Forest, Virginia, and Pittsburgh all on the bubble. Syracuse was in that same tier a little bit as well until they lost to NC State yesterday, and now they'll be out. I think Clemson should be in, but it is definitely harmful the way that yesterday went for them, and at this point, it's in the committee's hands now. Another team on the bubble that played in a wild, surprising game was Villanova, almost completely blowing their chances at making the tournament when they went down to the wire against DePaul. Nova entered the game as 24.5-point favorites, but it took a Justin Moore 3 with 8 seconds left in the game to retake the lead and escape with a win, keep their season alive. DePaul this season was 3-28 in the regular season, 0-20 in conference play in the Big East, but they led this game by as much as 8 points in the second half. That 8-point lead that they had just under 13 minutes was the largest lead they held in conference play all season long. And Nova even ended up evening up the score, took a brief lead. DePaul took it back with a jumper from Jalen Terry to make it 57-55. DePaul with 1:13 left in the game. Nova misses a shot. DePaul actually gets a couple rebounds, a couple offensive rebounds, but is not able to capitalize on it, and it was Moore ending up hitting the game winner. But this was not a convincing performance for Nova if they want to show they are worthy of a tournament spot. No question now, they have to beat Marquette. Tonight, the game tips off at 9:30. It might also take another win afterwards, likely against Creighton. We'll see how that all plays out. But we've seen Villanova play down to competition this season, but this was new lows for them, especially being that it was with their season on the line, essentially. So we will see how that all plays out for the Wildcats, but DePaul was not the only winless team in conference play that almost pulled off a shocker yesterday, and we won't spend too much time on this because I don't imagine either of these teams to be in the tournament, but was just shocking that an 8-24 Missouri team took Georgia down to the wire as well. They fell apart down in the stretch of that game. They led late, but could not hold on. Mizzou was 0-18 in the SEC this year. They come short of claiming a conference win where they had it in their hands but let it slip away from them late in that game against Georgia. Georgia, this was not quite as big of a potential upset. I remember looking at the line before the game. Georgia was just favored by 2.5 points. Was very strange for a Missouri team that hadn't won a single game in the SEC to be that close in terms of betting odds. But Georgia does end up winning. They end up covering for anybody who did bet on that game, but definitely a weird one in that. We also had Cincinnati beat Kansas. This wasn't a massive surprise. Kansas was without their top two players in Hunter Dickinson and Kevin McCullough Jr. They made it a little bit of a ball game in the second half. KJ Adams had himself a really nice scoring performance, especially getting going in the second half, but it just was not enough to keep up with Cincinnati that was at full strength. They ended up losing 72-52. Ultimately, we sort of knew this was likely going to happen, but it just does go to show additionally the state of Kansas Jayhawks basketball this year, where they are so top heavy, and outside of KJ Adams, nobody else was able to step up for them. Elmarco Jackson, the freshman who started the year for them, he was just 2 of 11. Nicholas Timberlake was 2 of 9, and Johnny Furphy, the other freshman who was a little bit of a revelation emerging for the Jayhawks midway through the season, now could be a potential first-round pick in the draft. He was 1 for 8. He's been struggling from a scoring perspective as of late, and I don't see it really with this Kansas team. Now, we know how good their starting lineup is, but if you are able to jam Hunter Dickinson, there isn't a great amount of shooting from the outside. They can play some defense when they're fully healthy, but again, this wasn't a surprise result by any means, really. It would have been a huge statement had they won, but it sort of reaffirms their issues where they're not a great shooting team. They don't have very much help outside of their top 3. Again, credit to KJ Adams for the performance that he tried to put on here, 9 of 14 from the field, and carried them as much as he personally could, but they end up falling short in this one to Cincinnati. We will see them again when the tournament begins. We also had Utah dominate Arizona State last night. Utah is hovering around one of those bubble spots, probably a little more so on the outside looking in, and there were some doubts with them whether or not they would have their leading scorer, Braden Carlson, for the game. He did played limited minutes, just 18, only scored, I believe it was 7 points, so not like it was a tremendous performance for him personally, but it did not end up mattering. The rest of the team really showed up big time for them, and it's going to be interesting. They face off against Colorado tonight, 2 teams that are on that little bit of a bubble line, have some arguments to make the tournament, and there's a chance that they both could make it, but depending on how this game goes, we could see at least one of them eliminated, and even then, we'll see. I think that Colorado has the advantage in this particular matchup, but I guess we'll also just have to see, because it's not that the committee takes into consideration recent play as much as they used to either, and Colorado has been playing some good basketball. But that is all we have time for on the show today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. We will be back tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Going to be a late one tonight if you are a college basketball fan watching that Utah-Colorado game. Tips off at 11:30 Eastern. But we will see you tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and thanks for listening.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn it.